October 27th, 1959. The telegram arrived at the Kremlin at 4:47 a.m. Moscow time, rousing Premier Nikita Khrushchev from an already troubled sleep. He had been dreaming about his childhood in Kalinovka, about the coal mines where his father had worked, about poverty so grinding that some winters they had eaten nothing but potatoes and black bread. Then the telephone rang, and the dream dissolved into the cold reality of nuclear-age geopolitics. "Comrade Khrushchev," said the voice of his aide, Oleg Troyanovsky, "we have confirmed intelligence from Turkey. The Americans have deployed Jupiter missiles at sites near Izmir and other locations. They are operational." Khrushchev sat up in bed, his stocky frame silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. His wife, Nina Petrovna, stirred beside him but didn't wake. He was grateful for that. She worried about him enough already, worried about the stress, the long hours, the weight of leading a superpower in an age when one mistake could mean the end of everything. "How many missiles?" he asked. 15, possibly more. "Our agents report they are medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads. Flight time to Moscow, approximately 10 minutes. Khrushchev felt something cold settle in his stomach. 10 minutes. That was how long he would have to decide whether the world would end. 10 minutes between the launch of an American missile from Turkey and the incineration of Moscow, of the Kremlin, of everything he had spent his life building. "Call a meeting of the Presidium for 9 a.m., he said, "and get me everything we have on these missiles. Everything." He hung up and sat in the darkness for a long moment, his mind working through the implications. The Americans had placed nuclear missiles on the Soviet Union's doorstep, missiles that could strike Moscow, Leningrad, Kyiv, the industrial heartland of the USSR. They could destroy the Soviet Union in minutes before Soviet forces could even respond. It was intolerable. It was a provocation. It was, Khrushchev realized, with a mixture of anger and grudging admiration, exactly what he would have done in their position. By 9 a.m., the Presidium room was filled with the most powerful men in the Soviet Union. Anastas Mikoyan, the urbane Armenian who served as first deputy premier. Andrei Gromyko, the stone-faced foreign minister. Rodion Malinovsky, the defense minister and war hero, and a dozen others who collectively ruled over 200 million people and commanded the world's largest army. Khrushchev entered the room without ceremony, his peasant's face set in hard lines. He was 65 years old, a survivor of Stalin's purges, a man who had clawed his way to power through cunning, ruthlessness, and an instinct for political survival that bordered on genius. But this morning, he felt old and tired and frightened in a way he hadn't felt since the Great Patriotic War. "Gentlemen," he said, taking his seat at the head of the table, "the Americans have deployed nuclear missiles in Turkey. 15 Jupiter missiles, possibly more, capable of striking Soviet territory in 10 minutes. I want to hear your assessments." Malinovsky spoke first. "Comrade Premier, this is an unacceptable escalation. These missiles fundamentally alter the strategic balance. We have bombers that can strike American territory, but they take hours to reach their targets. The Americans can now destroy our command structure, our missile sites, our cities, before we can respond. They have achieved first strike capability." "Can we counter it?" Khrushchev asked. "We're working on our own medium-range missiles, but deployment will take years. In the meantime, we're vulnerable, dangerously vulnerable." Gromyko cleared his throat. "Comrade Premier, we should protest through diplomatic channels. We should demand that the Americans remove these missiles. We should threaten consequences if they don't." "What consequences?" Khrushchev snapped. "What can we threaten that will make them take these missiles out of Turkey? An invasion, a nuclear strike. Both options lead to war, and war with America means mutual destruction." He stood and walked to the large map of the world that dominated one wall of the room. His finger traced the distance from Turkey to Moscow, then from the Soviet Union to the United States. Look at this. Look at the geography. They can put missiles in Turkey, in Italy, in Britain, in Japan. They have allies all around our borders. But where can we put our missiles? Where are our allies close to American territory? The room was silent. Everyone knew the answer. Nowhere. The Soviet Union had no military alliances in the Western Hemisphere, no bases within striking distance of the American mainland. Geography, which had protected Russia from Napoleon and Hitler, now worked against the USSR in the missile age. Khrushchev turned back to face them. The Americans think they're clever. They think they can surround us with missiles, can threaten us from every direction, and we'll just accept it. They think we're weak, that we'll complain but do nothing. Well, they're wrong. Mikoyan, always the voice of caution, spoke up. "Comrade Premier, what are you proposing?" Khrushchev walked back to his seat and sat down heavily. "I'm proposing that we think creatively. The Americans have put missiles in Turkey, 10 minutes from Moscow. So we find a way to put missiles somewhere 10 minutes from Washington. We create our own threat, our own pressure point. We restore the balance." "But where?" Malinovsky asked. "We have no bases near America. We have no allies in the hemisphere." "Not yet," Khrushchev said. "But what about Cuba?" The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Cuba, the island nation just 90 miles from the American coast, where Fidel Castro had overthrown the American-backed dictator Batista just months earlier. Cuba, which was now seeking Soviet support, Soviet aid, Soviet protection from American aggression. "You want to put missiles in Cuba?" Gromyko asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Why not?" Khrushchev replied. "The Americans put missiles in Turkey, right on our border. So we put missiles in Cuba, right on their border. We see how they like it. We see if they're as brave when nuclear weapons are pointed at them as they expect us to be." Mikoyan shook his head. "Comrade Premier, the Americans will never tolerate Soviet missiles in Cuba. They consider the Western Hemisphere their sphere of influence. They'll see it as an unacceptable provocation. And we should tolerate their missiles in Turkey." Khrushchev's voice rose. "We should accept that they can destroy Moscow in 10 minutes while we can only threaten them with bombers that take hours to reach American territory. Where is the justice in that? Where is the equality?" He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Gentlemen, I understand the risks, but I also understand that we cannot allow the Americans to maintain this strategic advantage. If we do nothing, if we simply accept their missiles in Turkey, we look weak. Our allies will doubt us. Our enemies will be emboldened. And the Americans will keep pushing, keep surrounding us with weapons, until one day they decide they can destroy us with impunity." Marshal Malinovsky nodded slowly. "If we place missiles in Cuba, we achieve strategic parity. The Americans will finally understand what it feels like to have nuclear weapons pointed at their cities from close range. It might force them to negotiate, to remove their missiles from Turkey in exchange for us removing ours from Cuba. Or it might start a war," Mikoyan warned. "The Americans are paranoid about their hemisphere. They have this Monroe Doctrine, this belief that the Americas belong to them. If we put missiles in Cuba, President Eisenhower, or whoever succeeds him, might decide to invade Cuba or blockade it, or even strike the Soviet Union directly." Khrushchev stood and walked to the window, looking out over the Kremlin walls toward the city beyond. Moscow. His city. The city he had helped rebuild after the war, where millions of Soviet citizens lived and worked and raised their families. The city that American missiles in Turkey could now destroy in 10 minutes. "I grew up poor," he said quietly, his back still to the room. "So poor that some winters we didn't know if we'd survive until spring. I worked in the mines, in the factories. I fought in the revolution, survived the Civil War, survived Stalin's purges. I've seen more death and suffering than any man should see in 10 lifetimes. He turned back to face them. "But I've also seen what we've built. I've seen the Soviet Union rise from the ashes of war to become a superpower. I've seen us launch satellites, build nuclear weapons, challenge America for leadership of the world. And I'll be damned if I let the Americans intimidate us now, when we're stronger than we've ever been." "So you've decided?" Gromyko asked. "Not yet," Khrushchev said. "First, I want to explore every diplomatic option. I want to protest the Turkish missiles through every channel we have. I want to make it clear to the Americans that we consider their deployment an act of aggression, and I want to see how they respond. If they're willing to negotiate, to remove the missiles, then maybe we can resolve this peacefully." "And if they're not willing?" Malinovsky asked. Khrushchev's eyes were hard. "Then we consider Cuba, but quietly, secretly. We don't announce our intentions. We don't give the Americans time to prepare. We simply deploy the missiles, make them operational, and then inform the Americans that what's good for the goose is good for the gander." Over the following months, Khrushchev pursued both tracks simultaneously. Publicly, he railed against American missiles in Turkey, calling them a threat to peace, a provocation, an act of aggression. At the United Nations, Soviet diplomats demanded their removal. In private meetings with American officials, Gromyko made it clear that the USSR considered the missiles unacceptable. But the Americans didn't budge. President Eisenhower and later President Kennedy insisted that the missiles were defensive, that they were there to protect NATO allies from Soviet aggression, that they would remain in place as long as the Soviet threat existed. Khrushchev read the diplomatic cables with growing frustration. The Americans weren't going to remove the missiles. They weren't going to negotiate. They were simply going to maintain their strategic advantage and expect the Soviet Union to accept it. In a meeting with his advisors in the spring of 1962, Khrushchev made his decision. "We're going to deploy missiles in Cuba," he announced. "Medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, capable of striking targets throughout the United States. We'll deploy them secretly, make them operational, and then announce their presence. The Americans will have to accept them, just as they expect us to accept their missiles in Turkey." "And if they don't accept them?" Mikoyan asked. "Then we negotiate," Khrushchev said. "We offer to remove our missiles from Cuba if they remove theirs from Turkey. A fair trade. Strategic parity. They can't refuse without looking hypocritical." But even as he said it, Khrushchev felt a gnawing doubt. The Americans were unpredictable, especially the young President Kennedy. He had been humiliated by the Bay of Pigs invasion, embarrassed at the Vienna summit. He might feel he had something to prove. He might react emotionally rather than rationally. Still, what choice did Khrushchev have? The missiles in Turkey were operational. They threatened the Soviet Union's existence. Something had to be done. The deployment to Cuba began in the summer of 1962. Soviet ships carried missiles, launchers, nuclear warheads, and thousands of troops across the Atlantic. It was an enormous operation, conducted in strict secrecy. The Americans suspected something was happening, but they didn't know the full extent of the deployment. Until October 14, 1962, when an American U-2 spy plane photographed Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. The news reached Khrushchev on October 16th. The Americans knew. They had discovered the missiles before they were fully operational, and President Kennedy was furious. Khrushchev sat in his office, reading the intelligence reports, feeling the situation spiraling out of his control. The Americans were convening emergency meetings. Their military was going on high alert. Kennedy was preparing to address the nation. "What have I done?" Khrushchev muttered to himself. "What have I done?" Mikoyan, who was present for the briefing, said carefully, "Comrade Premier, we still have options. We can deny the missiles are offensive. We can claim they're defensive, just as the Americans claim about their missiles in Turkey. We can—" "The Americans aren't going to accept that," Khrushchev interrupted. Kennedy can't accept Soviet missiles in Cuba any more than we can accept American missiles in Turkey. His political survival depends on removing them. Then what do we do? Khrushchev stood and walked to the window, the same window where he had stood 3 years earlier when he first learned about the Turkish missiles. He thought about that conversation, about his anger and frustration, about his determination to restore strategic balance. And now here he was on the brink of nuclear war, because he had tried to do exactly that. "We made a mistake," he said quietly. "I made a mistake. I thought I could force the Americans to understand what it feels like to have missiles on their border. I thought I could create leverage to get them to remove the Turkish missiles. But I underestimated Kennedy's reaction. I underestimated how threatened the Americans would feel." He turned back to Mikoyan. "The Turkish missiles made me angry. They made me feel vulnerable, threatened, humiliated. And now I've made the Americans feel the same way. And angry, vulnerable, humiliated leaders make dangerous decisions." "So what do we do?" Mikoyan repeated. "We find a way out," Khrushchev said. "We find a way to remove the missiles from Cuba without looking weak, and we get the Americans to remove their missiles from Turkey without them looking weak. We find a solution that lets both sides save face." "Is that possible?" "It has to be," Khrushchev said, "because the alternative is nuclear war, and no one wins a nuclear war." Over the next 13 days, the 13 days that would become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev and Kennedy engaged in a desperate game of brinkmanship. The world watched in terror as the two superpowers moved to the brink of nuclear war. American warships blockaded Cuba. Soviet submarines moved into position to challenge the blockade. American bombers went on alert, armed with nuclear weapons. Soviet missile crews in Cuba prepared their weapons for launch. The world held its breath. And in the Kremlin, Khrushchev wrestled with the consequences of his decision to place missiles in Cuba. On October 26th, he dictated a long, emotional letter to Kennedy. In it, he tried to explain his thinking, his motivations, his fears. He wrote about the Turkish missiles, about how they made the Soviet Union feel threatened and vulnerable. He wrote about the need for both sides to step back from the brink, to find a peaceful solution. "Mr. President," he wrote, "we and you ought not to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war, because the more the two of us pull, the tighter that knot will be tied. And a moment may come when that knot will be tied so tight that even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it. And then it will be necessary to cut that knot. And what that would mean is not for me to explain to you, because you yourself understand perfectly of what terrible forces our countries dispose." He offered a deal. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade the island. It was a face-saving compromise, a way out of the crisis. But even as he sent the letter, Khrushchev knew it might not be enough. The Americans wanted the missiles gone, but they might also want revenge, might want to humiliate the Soviet Union for daring to challenge them in their own hemisphere. The next day, October 27th, became known as Black Saturday. An American U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. Soviet submarines were being depth-charged by American destroyers. Both sides' militaries were on the highest state of alert. Nuclear war seemed inevitable. In the Kremlin, Khrushchev met with his advisors. The mood was grim. Some urged him to stand firm, to refuse to remove the missiles, to call Kennedy's bluff. Others urged him to back down, to accept whatever terms the Americans offered, to avoid war at any cost. Khrushchev listened to them all, then made his decision. "We're going to remove the missiles from Cuba," he announced. "We're going to accept Kennedy's terms, and we're going to do it now, before this situation gets any more out of control." "But Comrade Premier," Malinovsky protested, "we'll look weak. We'll look like we surrendered to American pressure." "Better to look weak than to be dead," Khrushchev snapped. "Better to lose face than to lose Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and every other Soviet city. Better to accept a diplomatic defeat than to start a nuclear war that will kill hundreds of millions of people. He stood and faced them, his peasant's face lined with exhaustion and stress. "Gentlemen, I made a mistake when I put those missiles in Cuba. I thought I was being clever, thought I was restoring strategic balance, thought I was teaching the Americans a lesson about how it feels to have nuclear weapons on your doorstep, but all I did was bring us to the brink of war." "The Turkish missiles," Gromyko began. "The Turkish missiles are still there," Khrushchev interrupted, "and they're still unacceptable. But Kennedy has privately agreed to remove them in a few months, quietly, without public announcement. We get what we wanted. The Turkish missiles gone, but we have to accept that it looks like we backed down in Cuba." "That's not fair," Mikoyan said. "No, it's not fair," Khrushchev agreed, "but it's reality. And in reality, we don't have the strategic advantage we thought we had. We don't have the ability to challenge the Americans in their hemisphere the way they challenge us in Europe. We overreached, and now we have to pull back before we all die." He walked to the door, then turned back. "Draft the message to Kennedy. Tell him we're removing the missiles from Cuba. Tell him we accept his terms, and tell him that we expect the Turkish missiles to be removed as he promised." "And if he doesn't remove them?" Malinovsky asked. Khrushchev smiled bitterly. "Then we'll have learned an important lesson about trusting American promises. But at least we'll be alive to learn it." The message went out on October 28, 1962. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade the island. The crisis was over. The world stepped back from the brink of nuclear war. But for Khrushchev, the crisis had lasting consequences. He had been humiliated on the world stage, forced to back down by American pressure. His enemies in the Kremlin saw weakness, saw an opportunity. Within 2 years, they would remove him from power, citing his harebrained schemes and reckless adventurism in Cuba. In his forced retirement, Khrushchev would reflect on the events of October 1962. He would think about the Turkish missiles that had started it all, about his anger and frustration, about his decision to place Soviet missiles in Cuba. And he would think about what he had said, what he had felt when he first learned about the American missiles in Turkey. In his memoirs, dictated secretly and smuggled to the West after his death, Khrushchev wrote, "When I learned that the Americans had placed missiles in Turkey, I was furious. I felt that they were threatening us, surrounding us, trying to intimidate us into submission. I said to my advisors, how would the Americans like it if we put missiles in Cuba, right on their doorstep, let them see how it feels to have nuclear weapons pointed at their cities? But I didn't understand, not really, what it would mean to act on that impulse. I didn't understand that the Americans would feel the same fury, the same fear, the same sense of threat that I felt about the Turkish missiles. I thought I was teaching them a lesson. Instead, I nearly started a nuclear war. The Turkish missiles were a provocation, but my response, placing missiles in Cuba, was a greater provocation. I escalated when I should have negotiated. I acted from anger when I should have acted from wisdom. And I brought the world to the brink of destruction. If I could do it again, I would handle it differently. I would protest the Turkish missiles more forcefully through diplomatic channels. I would build up our own missile forces to restore strategic balance. I would be patient, would wait for the right opportunity to negotiate their removal. But I wouldn't put missiles in Cuba. Because that decision, born from anger and pride and a desire to show the Americans they couldn't push us around, nearly destroyed everything. What Khrushchev said when he learned the U.S. put missiles in Turkey evolved over time, from initial fury to eventual regret. In October 1959, when he first learned of the deployment, how would the Americans like it if we put missiles in Cuba, right on their doorstep, let them see how it feels? In meetings with his advisors, the Americans think they're clever. They think they can surround us with missiles and we'll just accept it. Well, they're wrong. When deciding to place missiles in Cuba, We're going to deploy missiles in Cuba. The Americans will have to accept them, just as they expect us to accept their missiles in Turkey. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, I made a mistake. I thought I could force the Americans to understand what it feels like to have missiles on their border. But I underestimated Kennedy's reaction. When deciding to remove the missiles from Cuba, better to look weak than to be dead. Better to lose face than to lose Moscow and every other Soviet city. In his memoirs, reflecting on the events, the Turkish missiles were a provocation, but my response was a greater provocation. I escalated when I should have negotiated. I acted from anger when I should have acted from wisdom. The irony was not lost on Khrushchev. He had been so angry about American missiles in Turkey that he had placed Soviet missiles in Cuba, and that decision had led directly to the most dangerous moment in human history, the moment when nuclear war seemed inevitable, when the fate of civilization hung by a thread. The Turkish missiles were eventually removed, quietly, in April 1963. The Americans claimed it was part of a planned modernization, not a concession to Soviet demands. But everyone knew the truth. Kennedy had agreed to remove them as part of the secret deal that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, in the end, Khrushchev got what he wanted. The missiles that had made him so angry, that had threatened Moscow, that had prompted him to place Soviet missiles in Cuba, were gone. But the cost had been enormous. The world had come within hours, perhaps minutes of nuclear war. Khrushchev's political career had been fatally damaged, and the Cold War had been pushed to a new level of danger and instability. In Washington, President Kennedy also reflected on the crisis. In a speech at American University in June 1963, he spoke about the need for peace, for understanding between the superpowers, for recognition that both sides had legitimate security concerns. Above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war, Kennedy said. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. It was, in many ways, a repudiation of the policy that had led to the Turkish missiles in the first place. A recognition that surrounding the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons, while strategically advantageous, was also dangerously provocative. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev had learned the same lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis, that in the nuclear age, neither side could afford to humiliate the other, to push too hard, to ignore the other's security concerns, because doing so risked not just war, but the end of civilization itself. The Turkish missiles had seemed like a good idea at the time, a way to protect NATO allies, to deter Soviet aggression, to demonstrate American resolve. But they had also been a provocation, one that had led directly to the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War. And Khrushchev's response, placing missiles in Cuba, had seemed like a good idea at the time too. A way to restore strategic balance, to protect a socialist ally, to teach the Americans a lesson. But it too had been a provocation, one that had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. In the end, what Khrushchev said when he learned the US put missiles in Turkey was less important than what he did. And what he did, placing Soviet missiles in Cuba, was a decision that changed history, that taught both superpowers the limits of brinkmanship, that forced them to confront the terrible reality of the nuclear age. It was a lesson learned at enormous cost, but it was a lesson that may have saved the world, because after October 1962, both sides were more cautious, more willing to negotiate, more aware of the dangers of escalation. The Cold War would continue for another 27 years. There would be more crises, more confrontations, more moments of danger, but never again would the United States and Soviet Union come as close to nuclear war as they did in October 1962. And that, perhaps, was the ultimate legacy of the Turkish missiles and Khrushchev's angry response to them. Not the missiles themselves, not the crisis they provoked, but the wisdom that came from surviving that crisis. The wisdom that in the nuclear age, there are no winners in war, only survivors. And sometimes, not even that.